The candle had burned down to a coin of wax by the time Cecily Morrow heard footsteps on the flagstones outside the vestry door. She did not move. The register lay open before her on the clerk's table, the fresh ink of the entry she had copied still faintly damp in the cold November air, and the original page was folded inside the lining of her cloak, where it pressed against her ribs with the precise weight of a secret. Her hands, she noted with a detached interest, were perfectly steady. They had shaken earlier, when she first understood what Mr. Foss Crane intended, and they had shaken when she found her cousin Jane's name written in the Hartwell solicitor's neat, practiced hand across the top of the petition, as though Jane were a line item to be crossed out. They were steady now. She had done what she came to do. The footsteps paused. "The vestry is closed," she said. Her voice carried through the old oak door with more authority than she felt. A silence. And then the footsteps receded down the flagstone passage toward the south transept. And Cecily allowed herself one slow breath. She closed the register. She smoothed the altered entry with one finger, checking for any sign of the join where the copied page met the binding, and found none. She had her father's hand to thank for that. Thomas Morrow, parish clerk for 31 years, had taught her to write a hand so clean it left no trace of effort. What she had not considered in the 3 hours she had spent composing herself to this act was how long she would have to carry it. She blew out the candle. She lifted her cloak from the peg. She walked out of the vestry into the cold dark of the Thornley churchyard, and the original christening entry pressed against her heart all the long way home. The village of Thornley sat at the base of a limestone ridge in the north of Derbyshire, and its church of St. Alban held the parish registers going back 214 years. Cecily knew this because her father had told her when she was 7, lifting her onto the table so she could see the oldest volumes, the bindings cracked and soft as old bread. "Every name in here was a person," he had said. "Every person had a mother. Never forget that." She had not forgotten. She had grown up inside the registers, as other children grew up inside kitchens, learning their smell and their logic, the way a misplaced entry could throw a whole decade's tithes into doubt, the way a single blotted name could make an heir or unmake one. Her father had died in the March of 1812, leaving her the key to the vestry cabinet and a small annuity that covered her lodgings in the village, and very little else. The Reverend Aldous Peck, who had relied on Thomas Morrow's competence for 20 years, hired Cecily to continue her father's work as a matter of practical necessity rather than sentiment. She kept the registers, recorded the baptisms and burials and marriages, corrected the errors the visiting curate introduced when the vicar was ill, and was paid a clerk's wage for work that required, as she was aware, considerably more than a clerk's training. She did not complain. She had observed in her 24 years that women who complained about the disproportion between their labor and its reward were generally rewarded with less labor. Her cousin Jane Morrow had been a different sort of woman. Jane had been bright and impulsive, and had trusted a man whose name she had whispered to Cecily last Christmas, with the particular caution of someone who knows they are making a mistake and is making it anyway. Percival Hartwell, eldest son of the late Baron Hartwell, heir to the Hartwell estates and what remained of the Hartwell fortune. Jane had loved him. Cecily had thought, listening, that this was the most dangerous thing Jane had ever done, and she had said so. And Jane had laughed. Percival Hartwell was dead of a fever by April. Jane had delivered a girl in September, and died of the childbed fever herself 9 days after. Cecily had sat with the infant through 2 nights at the nurse's house before the Hartwell solicitor appeared, Mr. Rata. Silas Crane was a thin man with impeccable boots, and the manner of someone who had spent his career making difficult things easy for people who could afford to pay for the service. He had come to Cecily 2 weeks before, in the vestry, and laid his proposition on the table with the directness of a man who did not expect to be refused. The christening entry for Eleanor Rose, daughter of Percival Hartwell and Jane Morrow, had been recorded in the register on the 12th of October by the Reverend Peck. Mr. Crane wished that entry to disappear. In its place would stand a simpler record. A foundling, unnamed, received by the parish, and remanded to the Derbyshire Foundling Establishment. The The family would make a donation to the parish fund that would cover 3 years of the vicar's maintenance budget. Cecily would receive £10. "She has a name," Cecily had said, "Mr. Selly." Crane had looked at her with the mild patience of a man explaining a simple thing to a slow pupil. "She has a name and a register," he had said. "That is not the same as having a future. Lady Dorothea has considered the matter carefully. This arrangement is the kindest available." "I will not lose the page," Cecily said. Mr. Crane had smiled very slightly. "Only a clerk's girl," Lady Dorothea had apparently told him afterward, according to the fragment of conversation Cecily had overheard through the vestry window 2 days later. "She will take the money when she understands that refusing it accomplishes nothing." Cecily had gone home that evening and sat at her father's old desk for 2 hours, with the key to the vestry cabinet in her hand, and then she had understood what she was going to do. The truth was that she had always known. She had known the moment she opened the register, and found Eleanor Rose's entry written there in the vicar's careful script. The child's name and parentage set down in ink as plain as any other. There was a name. The name had been recorded. Someone had sat in the vestry and witnessed the child's entrance into the parish record, and that someone's witness could not be undone by a solicitor with good boots and £10, or it could, if you let it. Her own name was at the front of the register. Thomas Morrow had put it there himself. 30 years before, when the family of Cecily's mother had preferred that the birth not be formally noted at all, he had written it in his best hand, the hand he had spent a lifetime perfecting, and he had signed it as clerk and witness both, and he had kept his position for another 31 years by knowing exactly which matters required official documentation, and exactly what such documentation, once made, cost to undo. She knew what it cost. She had copied the page. She had replaced it with an entry that named the child simply as Eleanor Rose, foundling, received. She had folded the original inside her cloak and walked home through a November churchyard, and she had told no one. It was 3 days later that the Viscount Thornley came to review the register. He came officially as local magistrate, because the Hartwell petition had been lodged with the county court, and the court required a review of the relevant parish records before any amendment could be considered. Cecily had known this was coming. She had also known in the abstract that the Viscount Thornley served as magistrate for the district. She had not fully considered what it would mean for him to stand on the other side of the clerk's table from her, with the register open between them. He was taller than she had expected, though she had seen him twice in the village at a distance. He wore a dark coat and no affectation, and he read the register with the unhurried attention of someone accustomed to documents rather than intimidated by them. He did not speak for some time. She stood on the far side of the table and watched his eyes move down the page. The vestry was quiet in the particular way. Old stone buildings are quiet, a quiet that absorbs sound rather than merely lacking it. Outside, a wren was working in the ivy above the window, and she could hear it. She could also hear with an acuity that surprised her the precise sound of him turning each page. "This is the October entry," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, my lord." He turned back 2 pages, then forward again. His eyes stopped, and she felt the particular quality of his stillness, a stillness that was not indifference, but its opposite. He was not reading past the entry. He was reading it again. "Who taught you to write a hand this clean?" he said. Her pulse caught. "My father, my lord. He was the parish clerk before me." He looked at her then directly, in a way that the men who occupied positions of authority over her did not generally do, not assessment. Exactly. Something more careful than that, as though he was looking past the surface of her answer, for the thing the answer actually contained. "Thomas Morrow's daughter," he said. "Yes." He returned to the register. 1. His hand, turning the page, passed within an inch of hers, where it rested on the binding, and she moved her hand to her side, with a composure she did not feel. She noticed that his own hands were not the hands of a man who spent his time exclusively at paperwork. There were calluses at the base of his fingers from the reins, and a small scar above one knuckle that had healed cleanly a long time ago. She noted this and set it aside as irrelevant and was aware, even as she did so, that she was filing it. She had not been present when he heard her reading to Mr. Pye. She did not know that. She would not know it for several weeks. What she knew was that he turned the final page, closed the register, and said, "I will return on Thursday," and left the vestry without another word, which she told herself was the behavior of a man conducting routine business, and which her body, quite without her permission, told her was something else entirely. She stood at the table after he had gone and listened to his boots on the flagstones, receding toward the church door, and then to the heavy latch of that door, and then to nothing. She was aware that her breath had been shallower than usual for the past several minutes, a fact she attributed to the cold, which was an attribution she knew perfectly well to be false. Abel Pye was 71 years old and had lived in Thornley his entire life, which meant he had outlasted 4 vicars, 2 constables, a brief and disastrous attempt by a London family to introduce peacocks to the village green, and the entire reign of the old king. He sat on the same bench in the churchyard every afternoon the weather permitted, and Cecily read to him on Tuesdays and Thursdays from whatever volume she had to hand, because he had been present at her christening, and brought a shawl, and because his eyesight had failed enough that he could no longer manage the print himself. He was not a man who expressed gratitude in conventional ways, but he kept the bench clear of leaves on the days she was expected, and once when she had arrived with a cold and her voice at its worst, he had produced a piece of hard barley sugar from his waistcoat pocket, and set it on the bench beside her without comment, which was, she understood, precisely the kind of gesture her father would have called sufficient. She had not noticed the magistrate standing at the open vestry window on the Thursday. She read Mr. Pye, the 3rd chapter of Cowper's letters. She had been reading without performance, simply a voice in the cold air, and the old man had been listening with his eyes half closed and his face arranged in the expression of a man who is receiving something he requires, and it had not occurred to her until much later, weeks later, that the vestry window behind her had been open, or that someone standing in the passage beside it would have had a clear and unobstructed view of her reading, and of the way she paused when Mr. Pye coughed and waited without any sign of impatience, and of the manner in which she did not rush. She had simply read. She had done it the same way she did everything, as though the work itself deserved her full attention, without calculation, as to whether anyone was watching. Someone had been watching. Lady Dorothea Hartwell called on the Reverend Peck on a Thursday in mid-November, and Cecily was in the vestry adjacent to the study, and heard nearly all of it. Lady Dorothea was a handsome woman in her late 50s who wore her consequence the way an old soldier wears a uniform, as a matter of bearing rather than display. She did not raise her voice. She explained to the Reverend Peck, with the warmth of someone delivering instructions to a trusted subordinate, that the family had been caused some discomfort by the recent clerical confusion regarding a parish entry, and that while they had every confidence in the vicar personally, the employment of a clerk's assistant in so sensitive a position raised questions that the bishop's office had been known to take seriously. She mentioned the living. She mentioned the maintenance review. She mentioned with particular gentleness that the Hartwell family had historically been among the parish's most reliable benefactors. The vicar said very little. He was 63 and tired, and had been managing the Hartwell family's demands for the better part of a decade, and Cecily could hear the particular quality of his silence, the silence of a man who is doing arithmetic. She sat in the vestry with her hands folded on the register, and listened, and thought about her father's handwriting, and did not move. That evening she walked home past the church green, and through the parsonage windows she could see the light of a dinner party, several figures at table, and among them the upright dark shape of Edmund Ashby, Viscount Thornley, seated beside a young woman in a pale gown whose posture had the specific correctness of someone who has been told since childhood that this was how she should hold herself in company. The candlelight was golden and remote. Cecily looked for precisely 1 moment and walked on. She was a clerk's girl. She knew what she was. It was the following week that he came back to the vestry, and it was not about the register boundary dispute, though that was what he said when the vicar's curate admitted him. He reviewed the boundary map for 11 minutes. Cecily knew because she was counting, in the way one counts seconds during a difficult procedure as a discipline of attention. She also noted, with the detached precision she used as a substitute for composure, that he did not take the chair on the visitor's side of the table but stood, the map spread before him, which meant that when he looked up from it, he was only 6 feet away from her. She was very precisely aware of those 6 feet. She had begun, without her own permission, to measure the distances. Then he set the map aside and said without preamble, "Mr. Crane called here again." It was not a question either. "He did," she said. "What did he want?" She met his eyes. In the vestry light, which was gray and thin, and came through one small north-facing window, his face was difficult to read. Not cold, exactly. She had begun to understand that his stillness was a thing he had built, the way you build a wall, stone by stone, for reasons the wall itself does not explain. She had also begun to suspect, with the reluctant accuracy she brought to things she would have preferred to misread, that the wall was not the whole of what he was, what he wanted the first time, she said. A silence. He looked at the register on the shelf, and then back at her. "Do not answer Mr. Crane again without a witness present," he said. His voice was level and quiet. It was the kind of sentence that arrived without decoration. She heard, underneath it, something she did not know what to do with, and so she filed it behind her sternum and kept her face steady. "I am generally alone in the vestry," she said. "Then you will send word when he comes, and I will attend." She looked at him. She was aware of the quality of the air between them, of the exact distance across the table, of the way her own heartbeat had shifted from its ordinary register to something more attentive, more awake, in a way that had no practical name. "That seems an inconvenience for a man of your responsibilities," she said. "Send word," he said, and picked up the boundary map, and was at the door when he paused. He did not turn around. He stood at the door frame for a moment that lasted several seconds longer than it needed to, and then he was gone, and she sat down at the clerk's table because her legs had decided they were no longer fully reliable, and stared at the closed door for considerably longer than she would afterward be willing to admit. She asked herself, that night and several nights after, what she thought she was reading into the behavior of a man who was conducting a routine legal review. She produced reasonable answers. She did not believe them. The formal petition arrived on a Monday in early December. Mr. Crane submitted it to the parish through the curate, which was itself a choice, a way of making the document arrive dressed in routine rather than confrontation. The petition sought the formal correction of a clerical error in the October baptismal register, asserting that the entry recorded under the name Eleanor Rose was, according to supporting documentation submitted by the Hartwell family solicitor, incomplete and incorrect in its statement of parentage. The family requested that the entry be struck and replaced with a foundling notation consistent with the child's actual status. The child's actual status, as described in the petition, was no status at all. Cecily read the document twice. She understood that Lady Dorothea had moved the date forward because something had changed. She went over the weeks since the petition was lodged and found the point at which the pressure had increased. The Reverend Peck had mentioned, probably without intending to, that the clerk's assistant had not been cooperative. Lady Dorothea had concluded that the direct approach had failed and moved to procedural force instead. Lady Dorothea attended a vestry that afternoon with Mr. Crane and 2 churchwardens, both men of long standing in the parish who had received Christmas hampers from the Hartwell estate for 20 consecutive years. The vicar was present, visibly unhappy. Cecily stood at the table, with the register closed before her. It was 2 days after this, on a Wednesday afternoon, that Miss Georgiana Pell paid a call on the vicar's wife, and remained in the drawing room long enough to be seen by Cicely passing through the hall. Miss Pell was pale and pretty, and had her mother's gift for delivering information wrapped in solicitousness. "I hope you have not been troubled by all this difficulty," Miss Pell said, pausing in the hall with the expression of someone offering something they have already decided you cannot use. "Lady Dorothea was only saying yesterday that it is a great pity a clerk's girl should be made to take the burden of it. She said you would be far better placed at a different sort of position, one with rather less responsibility. Cecily looked at her and said, "Thank you, Miss Pell," which was the whole of what she had to say, and which she delivered in a voice so perfectly even that Miss Pell blinked. She went home and sat at her father's desk and held the vestry key in both hands and thought, with great clarity, that Thornley would side with the family. He was a peer. They were a peer's family. He had been to their dinner. The petition was procedurally sound, or nearly, and he was a magistrate, which meant he lived by procedure. She had nothing but an original page hidden inside a cloak lining, and her own knowledge of what a name recorded in ink was worth, and what it cost to take it away. She opened her father's desk and found the original christening entry where she had transferred it from the cloak, pressed flat and folded with care. She looked at it for a long time. Eleanor Rose Hartwell, daughter of Percival Hartwell, gentleman, and Jane Morrow, spinster. The vicar's signature. The date. Witnesses. She was summoned to appear before the magistrate the following Friday. She sat with that letter for a long time. It was written in Thornley's hand. She recognized that immediately, the same hand she had watched move across the boundary maps, precise and unhurried. He had not sent a clerk. He had written it himself. She could not decide whether this meant anything, and resolved to stop trying to decide. She had 3 days. On the first day she went about her work. On the second day she sat at her father's desk in the evening and read back through the register entries he had made in the years before she could write, the names he had committed to the record not because anyone with authority had asked him to, but because they were true and they deserved to be kept. On the third day she looked at the original page for a long time, and at the register and at the key in her hand, and she understood that the question was not whether she would produce the page. She had always been going to produce it. The question was whether she had the particular courage required to do it, in a room where a man she trusted would be watching, in case that trust proved to have been a misreading. She transferred the page to the front binding of the register itself, tucked behind the marbled end paper where her father had placed his own notes decades before, and she walked to the church on a clear, cold Friday morning in December, and did not shake. The vestry had been arranged, with some effort, as a hearing room. The clerk's table was moved to one side. Chairs had been placed for Lady Dorothea at the center, Mr. Crane beside her, the 2 churchwardens arranged behind, the Reverend Peck at the vicar's desk. Looking at nothing in particular, Miss Pell stood at the back, as an observer only, she had said, though the choice to come at all suggested she was there to witness a particular outcome. Abel Pye came in 3 minutes after Cecily, moving with his stick on the flagstones, and sat himself in the corner without asking anyone's permission. Edmund Ashby, Viscount Thornley, stood at the head of the room beside the small window, and he did not look at Cecily when she entered, which she took as confirmation of what she already expected. Mr. Crane presented the petition. He was efficient and careful and spoke for perhaps 6 minutes, and at the end of it the matter seemed on its surface clean. A clerical irregularity. A petition for correction. Standard procedure. Lady Dorothea said nothing. She did not need to. Her presence in the chair said everything. Then Thornley said, "Miss Morrow, you kept the register on the date in question." "I did, my lord, and you recorded the entry." "The vicar performed the christening." "I recorded the entry." "Yes, Lady Dorothea," he said, and his voice was the same level, quiet. It always was, a voice that moved through a room without raising itself. "You have suggested that the entry as it stands is in error." Lady Dorothea inclined her head. "The family's documentation is clear, my lord. The parentage recorded is disputed, and the solicitor's office has no record of the engagement which would have legitimized." "Miss Morrow," Thornley said without raising his voice and without letting Lady Dorothea finish, "is the entry in the register? The entry you made on the 12th of October? She had 1 second, perhaps 2. She reached into the front binding of the register and lifted out the folded page. She unfolded it on the table. She said, "No, my lord. This is the entry I made on the 12th of October. The entry currently in the register was made by me in substitution, to preserve this one. The rune did not make sound. Lady Dorothea's fan, which she had been moving in a steady rhythm in her right hand, stilled. Mr. Crane said, "This is irregular in the extreme." "It is," Cecily agreed. "I will accept whatever consequence the court applies to the irregularity. I would ask that the consequence not extend to the child." Thornley picked up the original page. He read it. He set it on the table and looked at it for a moment that was long enough that she could hear her own pulse. He looked up. He looked at Lady Dorothea. "Miss Morrow recorded the truth," he said. "I will not unmake it." Lady Dorothea's composure did not collapse loudly. It collapsed in the way a well-constructed thing collapses when the foundation has shifted. A fine, precise stillness passed over her face, her chin lifting very slightly, her eyes moving to the register, and then away. She was not a cruel woman. She was a woman whose certainty had, in this room, found its perimeter. "Mr. Cletus." Crane began to speak. Thornley said, "The petition is declined." And Mr. Crane stopped. The Reverend Peck pressed his hands together as though confirming to himself that they were still present. The two churchwardens exchanged a look. The old man in the corner made a small sound that was not quite a word and might have been relief. Miss Pell slipped out of the room with the practiced invisibility of someone who has learned to leave scenes before their conclusions are drawn. Lady Dorothea rose. She looked at Cecily for a moment, and Cecily looked back, and what passed between them was not triumph on Cecily's side, and not contempt on Lady Dorothea's. It was something quieter than either a mutual recognition that they had both done what they believed their obligation required, and that only one of them had been correct. Lady Dorothea inclined her head very slightly and left the room, and Mr. Crane followed, and the churchwardens dispersed into the passage. The Reverend Peck stood and said, "I think I will go and sit down," and went, leaving his study. To the afternoon light and the cold and Cecily and the old pensioner and the Viscount Thornley, who had not moved from his position by the window. Pye stood creaking and made his way to the door and paused. He looked at Cecily with his old eyes, which still held the specific warmth of someone who has been paying attention for 7 decades. "Your father would have been pleased," he said, and went out. The room held the silence of a place that has recently had many people in it. Thornley turned from the window. He looked at the register on the table, and the original page beside it, and then at Cecily, and she did not know what she looked like to him, but her hands were very steady, which was interesting to observe. "You knew you would be called to account for the substitution," he said. It was not an accusation. His voice was careful. "Yes, my lord." "And you did it regardless?" "The entry was true," she said. "Once it was true, it seemed to me that suppressing it was not a thing I was able to do." He was quiet for a moment. He came to the table not quickly and looked at the original page for a moment before he looked at her. His hand rested beside hers on the table, and she was very precisely aware of the distance between them, the warmth of his proximity in the cold vestry, the quality of attention in him that had been there from the first day, and that she had been carefully refusing to name. "What do you need now?" he said. His voice was very low. She held his gaze. She had prepared any number of answers for any number of questions she might be asked today, and this was not among them. "I do not know," she said, which was not true, and which was the truest thing she had said in weeks. His hand moved, not much. A fraction of an inch across the table, until the edge of his fingers rested against the edge of hers, and his eyes were on her face, and neither of them spoke. "The child will need placement," he said, still quiet. I have tenants who have been hoping for a child to foster a good family. Her name would be kept Eleanor Rose," Cecily said. "Eleanor Rose," he agreed. She looked at the original page. Her father's name was at the front of the register, visible through the open binding, his hand as clean and practiced as the day he had written it. Cecily Morrow, daughter of Thomas Morrow, clerk, and Mary Fletcher. Recorded the 14th of April, 1888. The ink was 30 years old, and still clear. She felt his eyes on her face, reading whatever was there. You recognized it? He said. From your own. Yes, she said. A silence, longer than the others. I will need to file a full account with the county court, he said. Your substitution will need to be explained in the record. There will be no formal penalty given the circumstances, but it must be recorded. I understand. You will come to the county offices to provide a statement. I will arrange for you to be accompanied by the vicar. Yes, my lord. Edmund, he said very quietly. She looked up. He was looking at her directly, the way he had the first day, but with the stillness in him shifted to something she no longer needed to translate. She did not say it yet. She was not ready to say it yet, and he did not press her, which told her something she already knew. The spring came to Thornley in increments. The snowdrops first, then the crocuses along the church path, then a pale, persistent light beginning to outlast the afternoon. Cicely walked to the church most mornings with the register key in her pocket. The key her father had pressed into her hand on a day she could no longer precisely date, knowing, perhaps, that she would need it. She had carried it so long, it had the temperature of her own body. Eleanor Rose was settled with the Calloway family at the eastern edge of the estate, a young couple with a warm house and a garden, and a spaniel who had decided, with the irrevocable certainty of dogs, that the infant was his particular charge. Cicely had visited twice. The child was sturdy and bright-eyed, and held things with a grip that suggested she would not let go of things she valued, which Cicely found on reflection entirely appropriate. Pye had told the story to half the village by the end of December, in the careful way he told stories, setting each detail in its place like stones in a dry wall. The church wardens had, privately, expressed something resembling remorse. Lady Dorothea had not returned to the parish, though a donation to the maintenance fund had arrived in January, unsigned, in the family's envelope. Cecily had received it without remark. The county court record was filed in January. The substitution was entered as the act of a clerk preserving an original document against the risk of procedural loss, which was not precisely the framing Cecily would have chosen, but which was, strictly, a defensible reading of her actions, and which had been written by a man who chose his language with considerable care. She had not seen Thornley since the county offices, which was 3 weeks ago, and she was in the church porch on the first truly warm morning of March, sorting the Easter service orders, when she heard his horse on the lane. He came through the lich gate without hurrying and stopped a few feet from the porch. He wore a dark coat, his hat in his hand, and the morning light on his face showed her something she had been carrying as a question for months, and now she read the answer plainly. The stillness in him had not, as she had originally thought, the quality of a man who has sealed himself off. It had the quality of a man who has been waiting, very carefully and with considerable discipline, for something he was not yet certain he was permitted to want. I am not here on parish business, he said. I did not think so, she said. I thought we might walk. He paused. If you are willing. She looked at him. She considered her options. Then she stepped off the porch and onto the path, and he fell into step beside her, leaving the correct distance between them till they had turned the corner past the yew tree, at which point he reduced the distance by one deliberate step, and she did not move away. They walked toward the lower field, where the estate began. The morning was cool and bright and smelled of turned earth and something green coming up through the cold, and neither of them spoke for a time, which was its own kind of conversation. She had learned, in the months since November, that he was a man who used silence accurately, who did not fill it when it was doing useful work. She had also learned that she was apparently a woman who found this quality restful, rather than uncomfortable, which had told her something she had been trying not to examine. She had the register key in her pocket. She found it with her fingers, in the way one finds a familiar object without looking, and held it. I should tell you, he said after they had walked a while, that there is a portrait in the gallery at the hall, my wife. I do not have it taken down. I think I will not have it taken down. She listened, very carefully, to what was under that. Not a warning, A declaration of a different kind, the kind a careful man makes when he wants the person beside him to understand the whole of what they are being offered, rather than only the part that is easy to offer.
She sounds,
Cecily said, as though she should be remembered. He was quiet for a long moment. She should, he said. Yes. He paused. The child she carried too, he lived only the one night. I have not known how to speak of him. Generally, you may speak of him to me, she said. Whenever you find occasion to. He looked at her then, and she thought she could see in the particular quality of his expression the moment when the wall he had built became simply a wall. Present, stone, real, and no longer load-bearing. They walked on. The estate wall came into view, the old grey limestone, warm in the March light, and she thought of all the entries in all the registers, all the names that had been written down and kept, all the ones that had nearly been lost, and the thin, bright line between them that was nothing more than someone deciding that the truth was worth the cost of recording it. I have been advised, he said, by no one in particular, that I am perhaps somewhat difficult to read. She looked sideways at him. The corner of his mouth shifted. A movement so restrained she might have imagined it if she had not been paying attention for the better part of 6 months. Only somewhat, she said. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. The field stretched away to the south, pale with new grass, and the church tower was visible above the yew line, and the light was the specific tender light of an English spring morning that is decided provisionally to be kind. A pair of lapwings turned over the far hedge, their wings catching the sun and going dark again. He turned toward her. He looked at her directly, in the way she had learned to look back. He held out his hand, palm up, in the manner of a man making an offer he has considered carefully and does not intend to withdraw. She placed the register key in it. He looked at it, and then at her. And the stillness in him was not a wall anymore. It was simply a man standing in a field, holding a thing she had trusted him with, and knowing precisely what it meant. She thought afterward that she had been ready for some time. She thought she had known it the morning she walked out of the vestry with the page against her heart, and understood that she would carry it as long as she had to, and as far as it needed to go. She had not expected to be met. That was the part she had not accounted for. He closed his fingers around the key. And the spring went on around them, indifferent and warm, and the church held its records and its names, and Eleanor Rose Calloway slept in her cradle with the spaniel at its foot, and the register key would be returned to its hook in the vestry cabinet by Tuesday, where it would remain, and everything that had been nearly lost was, for now and by choice, kept. If this story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments. These characters are glad to be known.